Freddie was 13 when he went to stay with his father in the mountains for the summer. His parents had divorced a few years earlier, and Freddie only saw his dad during holidays or long weekends. This was the first time he'd stay with him for an entire summer. The arrangement had been his mother's idea, an opportunity for father and son to bond, to reconnect. Freddie had been hesitant at first, nervous about being away from home for so long, but the mountains, wild and unexplored, had drawn him in with the promise of adventure. The cabin, nestled deep within the forest, was isolated from the rest of the world. It stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that stretched endlessly toward the sky. From the front porch, you could see the mountains rising in the distance, their snow-capped peaks gleaming white even in the heat of summer. The air smelled fresh and cold, and the wilderness around them was alive with sounds, rustling leaves, the distant cry of birds, and the soft sigh of wind weaving through the trees. At first, the days passed pleasantly enough. Freddie and his father would hike for hours, sometimes in comfortable silence, other times with his dad explaining how to navigate by the sun or find water if you got lost. At night, they would sit by the fire, and Freddie's father would tell him stories of the mountains, how they were older than anything else around them, how there were places deeper in the woods where no man had set foot for centuries. He spoke about the strange noises that came in the night, the superstitions the locals believed in. The stories were unsettling, but Freddie brushed them off as just that, stories. Over the days, it became clear to Freddie that something was off with his father. It started slowly, so gradually that he almost didn't notice. His dad began disappearing into the woods more often, leaving Freddie alone for hours at a time. When he returned, there was something different about him. Something subtle but unmistakable. He was quieter, more distant, his eyes glassy and unfocused as if his mind were somewhere else entirely. Freddie's father had always been a man of few words, but this silence felt different. It felt wrong. As the days went by, the change in his father grew more pronounced. He would stare into the forest for long stretches of time, as if listening to something Freddie couldn't hear. His movements became more abrupt, his responses shorter, almost mechanical. And there were moments, fleeting but terrifying, when Freddie swore his father's face didn't look quite right, like his expressions were forced, mimicked, a poor imitation of the man he had known. One morning, Freddie woke up to find his father gone. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, and a cold mist had seeped into the room. It wasn't unusual for his dad to go off on his own early in the morning, but this time felt different. The silence inside the cabin felt heavier than normal, as if the air itself was thick with something unseen. Freddie waited for hours, but his father didn't return. His anxiety grew, twisting his stomach into tight knots. By midday, he could wait no longer. Grabbing his jacket, Freddie set out into the woods, following the trails he and his dad had walked before. He called out, but the forest swallowed his voice. There was no reply. Only the soft crunch of leaves beneath his feet and the whisper of the wind through the trees. As he ventured deeper into the woods, a sense of dread began to settle over him. The forest, which had once seemed so full of life, now felt empty, desolate. He spoke about the strange noises that came in the night, the superstitions the locals believed in. The stories were unsettling, but Freddie brushed them off as just that, stories. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made Freddie's skin crawl. He realized he had wandered off the path, and when he stopped to get his bearings, he saw something through the trees, something lying on the ground. Freddie's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the object, dread building with every step. When he finally saw what it was, he froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was his father. He lay motionless on the forest floor, his body twisted in an unnatural way, his eyes wide open and staring blankly into the sky. Freddie's mind struggled to process the scene before him. His father wasn't just dead. He had been killed, but there was no blood, no signs of a struggle, just an eerie, unnatural stillness about the whole scene. It was as if something had taken his father's life with nothing more than a touch, like the life had simply been drained from him. Freddie stood rooted to the spot, his heart hammering in his chest. His skin prickled with the unmistakable feeling that something was watching him. Slowly, he turned, scanning the woods around him, and then he saw it. A figure emerging from the trees. For a split second, Freddie thought it was his father. The man looked just like him. Same clothes, same face, even the same way of walking. But something was wrong. His father's eyes gleamed in a way that made Freddie's stomach churn. His movements were too smooth, too deliberate, like he was a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. and then the thing smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across its face. This wasn't his father. His dad was dead, lying right there on the ground. Yet this thing had taken his form. It was mimicking him, imitating his every mannerism with a disturbing precision. The realization struck Freddie like a blow to the gut. This was one of the creatures from the old stories, the ones his father had mentioned in passing. He had thought they were just myths, local folklore meant to scare kids, but now, standing face to face with the creature, Freddie knew the truth. It had taken his father's form. But for what purpose? Then, like a puzzle falling into place, the answer came to him, and it chilled him to his core. His mother. She was coming to pick him up in a few weeks. The creature wasn't after him. It was after her, living in the city surrounded by more and more victims. It had killed his father not for food, not for survival, but for fun. It was playing a game, taking his father's place, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And Freddie was the bait. The creature's smile widened as if it could sense Freddie's thoughts, as if it enjoyed watching the terror grow in his eyes. It stepped closer, moving with a predatory grace that sent a fresh wave of panic through him. Freddie's mind raced. It would wait for his mother to arrive at the cabin. She'd pull up in the driveway, step out of the car, and see what she thought was her son, smiling, waiting for her. The creature would imitate him perfectly. Every smile, every gesture, and she wouldn't suspect a thing. Not until it was too late. Once they were alone, once they were far from the mountains and back home, it would strike again. And then it would wear her face, her life, like it had worn his father's. Freddie couldn't let that happen. He had to get away, had to find help, had to warn his mother. But the creature was too close now, and it moved faster than anything he had ever seen. Freddie turned and bolted into the woods, branches whipping at his face and arms as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature followed, its footsteps eerily silent behind him. Freddie ran harder, pushing his body to the limit, but he could feel the creature's presence behind him, relentless, inescapable. He was running out of time. His mind raced with images of his mother, of her smiling as she opened her arms to the monster that wore her son's face. He could already picture her fate, could see how the creature would strike once they were home, hidden from the world. His legs burned as he sprinted through the underbrush, but he knew he couldn't outrun it forever. There was no escaping what was coming. In that moment, the forest seemed to close in around him, dark and suffocating, the trees like looming sentinels bearing witness to the horror unfolding. The wind whispered through the branches, but its voice carried no comfort, only the weight of what Freddie now understood. He stumbled, falling to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature stopped just behind him, its presence like a shadow over his shoulder. It didn't need to chase him anymore. It had already won. Freddie could feel its cold, lifeless eyes on him, could hear the faint rustle of its movements as it prepared to take the next step in its twisted game. His mother would never know. She would see her son embrace him and take him home, all the while unaware that she was taking a monster into her house. And there was nothing Freddie could do to stop it. The creature stepped forward, and as it did, a white light flashed before Freddie's eyes. If someone you know starts acting strange, if their eyes seem just a little too cold, a little too distant, don't take the chance. Run.